being 1949, into Stalin's serfs in their own country. If the influence of the communists today in 1949 were confined to those who still believe that the Soviet Union is a peace-loving democracy, it would be negligible. If the cleverness of the communists and their sympathizers and dupes in appealing to our irrational and destructive impulses, which is weakening the democratic world, Stalin is in the enviable position in 1949 of having two hands to use for the destruction of the free world. As head of the Russian state, he is offering the German people the opportunity to revenge themselves on the West by allying themselves with Soviet Russia. Hoping to harness German nationalism to his chariot, he gives former Nazis honorable and well-paid positions in the German Communist police forces, which are in fact an army, and in the communist universities and administrative offices of the Soviet zone. Soviet Russia appeal today in 1949 in Germany is mainly addressed to former Nazis who are welcomed to the ranks of their ideological brothers in the Communist Party. At the same time as the Pope of the Communists, At the same time as the Pope of the Communist Church, which is supposed to transcend national barriers, Stalin instructs the faithful in other lands to demand the implementation of policies calculated to drive the Germans to side with Soviet Russia, because they despair of ever being allowed to earn a living under the Western military occupation. This double game would be too obvious to be successful were it not for the influential writers, radio commentators, professors, and other molders of public opinion who allowed themselves to be influenced by the communists, either because they are ignorant or because they are ambitious, or because of the skill of the communists in playing upon national and racial hatreds and keeping alive the passions engendered by the recent war. The American people would now have learned the self-defeating nature of United States policy towards Germany were it not for the influence of communist sympathizers, spread in the manifold and subtle ways of communist sympathizers, spread in the manifold and subtle ways in newspapers, periodicals, and books by popular lectures and the teachings of university professors among senators, congressmen, and businessmen, fearful of the stigma of red-baiting attached to those who question the communist definition of liberalism and progress. The communists and their hanger-oners have succeeded in convincing a large number of Americans in 1949 that justice and mercy are reactionary, and sympathy for the underdog a sign of fascist sympathies. They almost succeeded in convincing a majority of Americans that the vengeance on the defeated, even at the cost of imposing a crushing burden on the American taxpayer, is the way to ensure peace. Communist influence, so strong in the Roosevelt era, has been largely responsible for our treatment of Germany, in our repetition and exaggerated form of our mistakes made by France and England after World War I. Nor is this influence now dead, in spite of the growing awareness of the American people of the danger it constitutes in 1949. French influence has reinforced that of the communists to convince the American people that Germany should be kept disarmed and deprived of liberty and sufficient industrial capacity to exist without American subsidies, a policy which must eventually succeed in forcing the Germans to side with Soviet Russia in 1949. We have not only once again imposed a crushing reparation burden on the German people. This time we've also deprived an already overpopulated Germany of the territory without which her people cannot be fed, and of the industries which would produce the exports with which to buy the food otherwise unobtainable. Germany, which formerly supplied Western Germany with food, we agreed to the expulsion of more than 12 million Germans from Sudetenland, which we gave to Poland. From the Sudetenland, inhabited by the Germans for centuries past, and from Yugoslavia and other East European countries with minorities of German racial origin. If ever the history of our times can be written by the scholars, free of the national prejudices, the crimes against humanity committed by the victors of the Second World War of the 20th century AD will appear as equal to those committed by the Nazis. For an objective observer of the crimes, follies, and cruelties of mankind cannot deny that exportations and expulsion from their homes of millions of people for the sole crime of belonging to the German race was an atrocity comparable with the extermination of the Jews and the massacres of the Poles and Russians by the Nazis. The women and children who died of hunger and cold on the long trek from Cesena and the Sudetenland to what remained of the German Reich may have thought that a quick death in a gas chamber would have been comparatively merciful. Nor will that mythical person, the historian of the future, when he comes up to draw up the balance sheet between Nazi crimes and those of their conquerors, fail to register against the democracies our decision to halt our armies on the Elbe in order to allow the Red Army to sack and ravish Berlin. If imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, no one ever paid a higher compliment to the Nazis than their conquerors. Instead of acting according to democratic principles we had gone to war to preserve, we tore up the Atlantic Charter and copied the Nazis in our repudiation of international law. Instead of demonstrating our belief in the Christian and liberal principles which had made America the strongest power in the world, we reaffirmed the Nazi doctrine that might makes right. Instead of showing the Germans that Hitler's racial theories were both wrong and ridiculous, we ourselves assumed the role of a master race. Instead of establishing a rule of law according to which individuals are punished only for the crimes that they themselves have committed, and only after proof of their guilt has been established, we have indicted the whole German nation for Hitler's crimes in 1949. We told the cold, hungry Germans in the cities shattered by our obliteration bombing that they could expect neither justice nor mercy. But although we had disenfranchised them as punishment for Nazi crimes, we would teach them to love democracy. Instead of recognizing that their unconditional surrender put us under a moral and legal obligation to ensure a fair deal for the German people, we did exactly the opposite. We proclaimed at Nuremberg that we no longer considered ourselves bound by the Hague or Geneva Conventions because Germany had surrendered unconditionally, but that we should punish all Germans for having similarly disregarded the international law when they were the victors. The original directives given to the United States occupation forces ordered them to do nothing to revive the German economy and disclaimed all responsibility for the feeding of the conquered, although we ourselves insisted during the war that Germany must provide enough food for the people of the countries she had occupied. However impossible this was, owing to our blockade, and it was agreed at Potsdam that the victors were entitled to the exact reparations in kind in the form of forced labor, a provision taken full advantage of by the Russians, who held millions of prisoners of war as slave laborers and conscripted men and women in their zone to work in chain gangs or concentration camps. The soldiers of the United States were told that they were entering Germany not as liberators but as conquerors. The task of occupation forces were conceived as entirely negative. It was to demilitarize, denazify, decentralize, and deindustrialize the defeated enemy country. Nothing was to be done to make the Germans believe that the victory of the democracies offered freedom, hope, or justice. Instead, we proceeded to teach the Germans that their dead Führer had been right in saying that Germany failed to conquer, she would be destroyed. Woe to the vanquished was our motto, as it had been to Hitler's. For 3 years after the unconditional surrender, we kept Germans on rations little or no larger than those in the Nazi concentration camps. All Germans, even those who emerged from Hitler's prisons, were starved and humiliated. Germans were forbidden on pain of imprisonment to criticize the Soviet Union or complain of its inhumane treatment of those we had delivered over to the communist terror. American and German communists and fellow travelers were installed in influential positions in the military government, in the German state, and in town administrations, on denazification boards, and as newspaper editors and managers of radio stations. We did our best to convince the Germans that we had no objections to totalitarian doctrines and practices so long as they served the interests of Soviet Russia instead of those of German nationalism. We not only made a mockery of our democratic professions by the power and influence we accorded to both American and German communists, we also taught American youth to abjure the principles of the American people had been told that they were fighting to preserve. American soldiers on entering Germany were given indoctrination courses in hatred and taught to have no mercy or pity in dealing with the wicked German race, just as the young Nazis had been taught to hate and abhor the Jews. The Morgenthau Plan, approved of by President Roosevelt at Quebec, was the basis of the Army's notorious order JCS 1067, which laid down the pattern of our original occupation policy. The Montague Plan for the pasteurization of Germany, had it been carried out, would have constituted the greatest act of genocide perpetrated in all modern times. The Germans would have been deprived of almost all their industries, and since their soul is incapable of supporting more than the present agricultural population, at least 30 million people would have died of starvation. The humanitarian scruples of the American people prevented the execution of this infamous plan. Unfortunately, however, JSC 1067 remained as the textbook of our occupation forces until 1947. According to this Army order issued to General Eisenhower in April 1945, no steps toward the economic rehabilitation of Germany or designed to maintain or strengthen the German economy were to be taken. Military government was explicitly instructed to prohibit and prevent production in a long, comprehensive list of industries. The food consumption of the German people was to be held down to a minimum, with surpluses made available to the occupying forces and displaced persons, with a total disregard of the fact that a German deprived of her eastern breadbasket by the Russian occupation and by the Polish seizure of Silesia had no possibility of feeding herself even at a near starvation level. It was decreed that ration scales should be low enough to permit the use of net surpluses for the substance of the occupation forces and displaced forces and for export. Army Order JCS 1067 explicitly states that, quote, Germany will not be occupied for the purpose of liberation, but as a defeated enemy nation, end quote. It went on to say that reparations and restitutions were to be exacted, and no political activity permitted. Fraternization with the enemy was strictly forbidden. We were determined to out-Nazi the Nazis in our own treatment of the conquered. American soldiers were threatened with punishment should they behave like Americans and aid the destitute and helpless. Kindness, even to German children, was held to a misdemeanor. GIs were forbidden to take a morsel of food off their plates to give to the starving, and mess sergeants were instructed to throw away food left over and not let any Germans have it. Even the gift of coffee grounds to the Germans was forbidden. Not only was charity forbidden and pity regarded as un-American, GIs and officers, if it was not positively encouraged to loot were in no way discouraged from committing the same excesses as the Russians